All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Randy Anderson, and on behalf of our leadership team here at Science, Scripture, and Reason, we'd like to welcome you to our September meeting. And we are very happy to have Dr. Kirk Bertsche with us this evening. Kirk earned his Ph.D. in physics from the University of California at Berkeley, and his graduate research involved design, construction, and operation of a small low-energy cyclotron for radiocarbon dating. Dr. Bertsche has worked at a number of Department of Energy national laboratories on projects involving particle accelerator design and operation, including radiocarbon dating with AMS. He has over 60 scientific publications and 18 patents, and that's quite impressive, Kirk. He's a scholar with Reasons to Believe organization, and that he and his wife Sabina live in San Jose and have been very active in the Sabina in the San Jose RTB chapter, and when the chapter transitioned to a separate group that's now called Let the Evidence Speak. So Kirk, thank you so much for coming here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it will work. And I've got quite a bit of material here. It might go a little fast, so if you have any questions, feel free to contact me afterwards. And just a sec, I've got to get my screen to work a little better because it's covering up. There we go. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Once upon a time, there was a family of mice that lived inside a piano. Every afternoon, they heard beautiful music played by a concert pianist. Now, they'd never seen this pianist, never met him. They knew about him from their parents, and their parents had heard from their parents, and so it went. One day, a little scientist mouse crawled around while the music was playing, and he discovered that while the music played, there were strings that vibrated. And he scampered back and told his friends, there's no piano player at all. It's just vibrating strings. And as they studied it more and more, they found hammers that hit the strings, and they developed a whole theory of music inside the piano that ruled out the pianist. And that parable is based on an illustration that's 140 years old by a fellow named William George Ward, but it's still relevant today. For these mice, the piano is their universe. They're confined to that universe of the piano. Does anything exist outside of their universe? And if it did, how would they know? And I think you can see the point of the parable. Today, people deny that there's a God outside of our universe. And how would we know whether there's a God or not? So let's think about tonight some of the evidence that there is that God exists. Evidence for God. Two questions this evening. Is there a God? First one, and that's the main question we're going to look at. And then, is God still active if he exists? And we want to look at two worldviews this evening. The first worldview is naturalism. And the second worldview is biblical theism. Now, there's a lot more possible worldviews than these two, but we're just going to look at these two. And what is it that we mean by naturalism and by biblical theism? Naturalism, we can see in these two quotes. Yuri Gagarin, the first Russian cosmonaut that went to space, said, he is supposed to have said, I went up to space, but I didn't encounter God. That was actually the words of Nikita Khrushchev, not Gagarin. And so he looked, he didn't see God, so God doesn't exist. And then Carl Sagan puts it well, the cosmos is all that is or was or ever will be. That's the view of naturalism, that nature is everything. There's nothing outside of nature, nothing beyond nature. What do we mean by biblical theism? David expresses it pretty well. In Psalm 19, the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their utterances to the end of the world. And if you look at what David's saying here, how often does this happen? The verbs in the first two verses there are all in continuous tense. It keeps declaring. The heavens keep telling the glory of God. The expanse keeps declaring the work of his hands. And in verse 2, it happens every day and every night. So this is biblical theism. And who does it declare this to? To everyone, to the whole earth. Verse 3 is a bit hard to translate. Some translations say there is no speech, their voice is not heard. Others can render it as there is no speech where their voice is not heard. And I think the New American Standard here is probably a little better, but it's a little hard to tell. But the point is that this is not literal language, and yet it speaks to everyone. It's accessible to all. So according to David, nature proclaims to everyone everywhere that God exists. And Paul says something quite similar in Romans 1. He says, that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So he says it's clear to all. It's been clear since creation. And it's interesting, it's still clear after the fall that we read about in Scripture, after man's mind has been affected by the fall. It's still clear that God has created the universe. So we want to look at these two worldviews tonight, and we want to try to compare them with something like the scientific method. So let me describe the classic scientific method, and you may remember this from school. Most of us were taught this. I don't remember where, junior high or something. Classic scientific method is a cyclic thing. We formulate a theory. Can you guys see my cursor when I moved it here?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we formulate a theory, then we predict the consequences of that theory, then we perform experiments, observe the results, and tweak the theory if we have to, or we confirm the theory. And it's important, it's not well known by non-scientists, but science never proves a theory. What it does is it says, if the theory is true, then we get these consequences. We see if the consequences are there, and then that confirms the theory, but it doesn't prove the theory. Scientific theories can be evidenced or supported, but they can never be proven. Now, I'd like to use a similar approach tonight to look at these two worldviews. And this is not a scientific question. This is a philosophical or theological question, whether God exists. But we can use a similar approach. Scientific method is pretty general, and it can be used for all sorts of things that aren't even science. So I'd like to compare those two worldviews, look at the consequences of the worldviews, look at the universe, look at the world, and say which worldview is better supported. So let's look at some of the evidences. I'd like to look at 6 different classes of evidence for whether or not God exists. First is the design of the universe, then the existence of the universe, then the comprehensibility of the universe, and mathematics, beauty and morality. And let's see which worldview fits best. The design of the universe. And some of you, if you've been to Reasons to Believe meetings before or heard much from Reasons to Believe, you're familiar with a lot of this. But here's a picture of the universe. The sun is right here, solar system, below the center. And this is Milky Way diagram is not a photograph, of course. This is made from satellites, reconstructed what our Milky Way galaxy looks like. Until about the 1970s, it was thought that we were just an average planet in an average solar system in an average galaxy. And that's called the Copernican principle, that everything is just average. And now we know that we're in a very special place in the universe that allows us to live. If we were in an average place, we could not survive. For example, if we were too close to the galaxy's center, there would be too much radiation from black hole, the black hole that we believe is at the center of the galaxy. If we were too far away from the center, there wouldn't be enough heavy elements, chemical elements, to support life. And if we were in one of the major arms, there would also be too much radiation. We end up in a minor arm of the Milky Way galaxy, and just kind of at the right distance from the core to have enough heavy elements, but not to have too much radiation to kill us. Also, in the solar system itself, which I haven't shown here, we have to be the right distance from the sun. If we're too close to the sun or too far away from the sun, we don't have liquid water. It's either all vapor or it's all frozen. We also have to have a Jupiter-like planet that sweeps out asteroids so they don't hit the Earth and wipe out life. We have to have an unusually large moon that helps to stabilize the Earth. And there's many things like this that seem to be designed just to allow life, just to allow us to be here. For more details, see the book by Richards and Gonzalez. So how do the two worldviews explain this? Naturalism says this is all chance. We just happen to be in the right spot in the galaxy, happen to be in a universe, happen to be in the right spot in the solar system so that everything works. Biblical theism says God created this place for man intentionally. Another strong evidence for design is Fred Hoyle. And I need to explain a little bit about how we get the heavy elements. First, at the Big Bang, in the early universe, helium and hydrogen were made. And heavy elements, heavier than helium and hydrogen, have to be made by sticking together heliums and hydrogens into something bigger. So how do you get carbon? We need carbon for life. Helium is mass 4. It's 2 protons and 2 neutrons in the nucleus, so it's helium-4. And to get carbon-12, you have to stick 3 helium-4s together. Problem is you stick 2 helium-4s together, you get beryllium-8, which is unstable. It falls apart. And so in order to get 3 to stick together, you have to do it almost simultaneously. The chance of that happening is extremely small. And it can barely work if you have very hot temperatures and high pressures inside a star, but it still doesn't work unless there's a resonance in the carbon-12 nucleus just at the right energy level. So Fred Hoyle was studying this and trying to explain how you get the heavy elements. And he realized there had to be this resonance state that nobody knew about. So he predicted it, and it was later found by Willie Fowler experimentally. And Hoyle realized that this fine-tuning implied design. It implied that this wasn't just random chance. It was exactly where it needed to be in order to form carbon. and it left Hoyle greatly shaken. He was, and as far as I know, passed away as an atheist. He was greatly shaken by this prediction. And as he says, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. And then the Big Bang itself. Now, some Christians are resistant to the Big Bang and view it as sort of an atheistic theory. It's not at all an atheistic theory. It was proposed by a Catholic priest, Lemaitre, Belgian priest. And the idea is that it was noticed by Hubble that the universe is expanding. And the idea is if you turn time backwards, at some point, everything was all together in the past. And the universe started as a small point. There's very good evidence for the Big Bang, lots of types of evidence. I don't have time to go into all of that tonight, but I do have another talk on that that I've given in the past. And it's interesting that Lemaitre may have gotten this idea from Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote a book earlier about it, and Lemaitre was a Poe fan. When this first idea first came out, it was strongly resisted by naturalists. And the idea of an eternal universe had been in favor since ancient Greece. Hoyle, from the last slide, is the one who named it the Big Bang out of derision. He thought this was a ridiculous idea. And even as late as 1989, John Maddox wrote an editorial in the journal Nature that was critical of the Big Bang. His reason being because it leaves open a door for creationism. The Big Bang is, as it's understood, it's the beginning of all space, time, and matter. And it's not just a big explosion. It's an extremely fine-tuned expansion. Experimental evidence was found for this by Penzias and Wilson in 1962. They were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1978. And if this is the beginning of all space, time, and matter, the origin of it, the cause of it, must be outside of the universe, outside of space and time and matter. So there must be some sort of a transcendent origin to the Big Bang, to the universe. And the Big Bang is extremely fine-tuned. We've looked at some of the design fine-tuning arguments of our place in the universe. But the Big Bang is one of the most exquisitely fine-tuned things in ever. The mass density of the early universe has to be very precisely tuned. If it's too massive, the universe collapses too early. It wouldn't last for 13.7 billion years. If the mass density is too low, it expands too rapidly, and you wouldn't have stars coalescing. And besides the mass density being right, there has to be just a very small amount of asymmetry, anisotropy in the universe, so that you do get some of it coalescing as stars and as galaxies. The tuning precision on just the mass density is 10 to the minus 60th of the natural scale given by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and quantum mechanics. And we don't know of anything else that is that finely tuned. It's extremely fine-tuned. So the question is, why and how is the universe so finely tuned? It could be that there's some unknown physics that we don't know about. That's the view of Victor Steger. And it's interesting, he's an agnostic or an atheist, probably an atheist. He has a model that you can access on the web to design universes. And you can change all these different parameters and make different universes. The one parameter that he does not have that you can vary is this mass density of the universe, because it has to be so finely tuned. He doesn't believe it could just happen that way. He thinks there must be something in physics that's forcing it. if so, we don't know what it is. Or another option is that the universe is cyclic, that it expands and contracts, expands and contracts. Nowadays, that's very difficult to hold that view. It was actually one of my classmates who was the co-discoverer of what they call now dark energy. He found that the universe is now expanding faster. If you look at the black line on the plot up here, the universe is expanding. The expansion slows because of gravity. It starts expanding fast. It slows down because gravity is trying to pull it back together. But what Saul Perlmutter and others found is that the universe started expanding faster again. And nobody understands why. They just call it dark energy, and they're trying to figure out the cause of it. So if the universe is expanding faster and faster, it's hard to believe it would ever be a cyclic thing and would collapse on itself. Another very common explanation for this is it's not fine-tuned. There's just a nearly infinite number of universes, a multiverse, and we happen to be in the one that works just right. And that doesn't really explain things. As some agnostics have said, that's a nice story, but it doesn't explain why this universe is designed the way it is. And then the last reason, the explanation for the fine-tuning is divine design. If there's a God and he created it, that explains what's going on. So you pretty much have two choices, an infinite number of universes or an infinite God, or some unknown physics that we have no clue about. Stephen Hawking has said, the laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers like the size of the electron charge of the electron and the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. So Stephen Hawking, who was at best an agnostic, probably an atheist, notices that this fine-tuning is just much more than you'd expect to happen at random. Paul Davies, who's an agnostic, says it seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. Neither of these two men holds to a biblical worldview, yet they see evidence for design very clearly. Another place that we see evidence for design is in biology. And if you could turn the volume up now, I'll see this clip.
What you are about to see is DNA's most extraordinary secret, how a simple code is turned into flesh and blood. It begins with a bundle of factors assembling at the start of a gene. A gene is simply a length of DNA instructions stretching away to the left. The assembled factors trigger the first phase of the process, reading off the information that will be needed to make the protein. Everything is ready to roll. 3, 2, 1, go. The blue molecule racing along the DNA is reading the gene. It's unzipping the double helix and copying one of the two strands. The yellow chain snaking out of the top is a copy of the genetic message, and it's made of a close chemical cousin of DNA called RNA. The building blocks to make the RNA enter through an intake hole. They are matched to the DNA, letter by letter, to copy the A's, C's, T's, and G's of the gene. The only difference is that in the RNA copy, the letter T is replaced with a closely related building block known as U. You are watching this process called transcription in real time. It's happening right now in almost every cell in your body.
So you can turn the volume back to normal now. So this thing, as it pulls apart the DNA and makes a copy, there's a mechanism in this molecule that is kind of like a read head on a tape recorder, and it reads things and then it makes a copy. It's amazing design, or at least appearance of design. And the problem, though, is even deeper. The origin of life research field can't make DNA. And even if we could make it, what gives meaning to the DNA? What makes all these letters mean something? How do we get reproduction? And that's something that occurred to Anthony Flew. And Anthony Flew was a philosopher, a longtime atheist. He became a deist at age 81. He realized there's got to be some sort of a God who designed things. And it was because of thinking about the biology and the fine-tuning here. It says the philosophical question that has not been answered in original life studies is this: how can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replicating capabilities, and coded chemistry? Here we're not dealing with biology, but an entirely different category of problem. So what he's saying is, it's not just a matter of putting all these chemicals together and making DNA or making base pairs. The problem is what gives it meaning. It's what John Lennox calls semiotics. What gives meaning to those characters and to those base pairs? What tells anything else in the world that this is now a code to code for DNA? There's nothing in the chemistry or the biology that would give meaning to it. So we see a lot of evidence for design in 3 different areas we've looked at, or 4. How do our 2 worldviews explain this? With the worldview of naturalism, we have to say the design, this evidence for design is just an illusion. It's not real design. It's just chance, and it looks like it's design. With biblical theism, we say there's a creator who designed things, and he did it intentionally. Let's look at the next one, the existence of the universe. And many great thinkers have asked, why is there something rather than nothing? Stephen Hawking says, the usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the question of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? Is the unified theory so compelling that it brings about its own existence? Or does it need a creator? And if so, does he have any other effect on the universe? Why does anything exist at all? And how do our 2 worldviews explain this? For naturalism, I think it's a puzzle. There's no good answer. For biblical theism, we look back at Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then the comprehensibility of the universe. Why is the universe understandable? Now, this might not look very comprehensible to some of you, but this is Maxwell's equations. I use them almost daily in my work. These 4 equations describe all of electricity and magnetism. Electromagnets, permanent magnets, electric fields, electricity, even radio waves and light waves. All of that is described by these 4 equations. And yet they're simple enough to fit on a t-shirt. We can understand how all this stuff works and reduce it to equations. Why is it? Why is it that we can understand the universe? Why is it understandable by humans? And also the comprehensibility of the universe. Albert Einstein says the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. You find it strange that I consider the comprehensibility of the world as a miracle or as an eternal mystery. Well, a priori, one should expect a chaotic world, one which cannot be grasped by the mind in any way. A high degree of ordering of the objective world could not be expected a priori. This is the miracle which is constantly being consistently reinforced as our knowledge expands. So what he's saying here, if you get the point, if our universe all came about through random processes, it should have random behavior. It shouldn't behave in an orderly way that's predictable, and it shouldn't behave in a way that's understandable by us, that we can comprehend. Why do we find nature comprehensible? How do these two worldviews explain this data? In the worldview of naturalism, it's sort of a puzzle, and you've got to invoke some sort of emergent order from the chaos, that the chaos just emerged, order emerged out of chaos. But with biblical theism, man was made in God's image. So if God knew what he was doing and he made us in his image, we can understand and comprehend some of what he did. Another evidence, I think, is mathematics. There's a famous paper written by Eugene Wigner that almost all physicists have heard about. It's called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. And what he was puzzling over was, why do we go and invent theoretical mathematics just sitting in our easy chairs and doing theory, and then we find that that applies to the real world? He says the enormous usefulness of mathematics in the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and that there is no rational explanation for it. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. So he's saying we wouldn't expect this to happen, that we can do theory unrelated to the real world, and then it applies to the real world. In fact, Maxwell's equations that I just showed were discovered the equations were discovered before we discovered radio waves, but it describes radio waves perfectly. And beyond this, just the origin of mathematics, there have been debates for probably centuries: is mathematics invented or discovered? But I think most mathematicians would say that it is discovered. It's not something we invent, it's something we discover. And just think about it. Did 2 + 2 = 4? Was that true before the universe existed? And yeah, it has to be. It's a kind of a transcendent truth. So how can naturalism even be true? How can a random universe produce timeless, eternal, transcendent truths? Things like this, like mathematical truth, can't arise from nature. It's got to be outside of the physical universe. So how do the two worldviews explain mathematics? Naturalism has to be augmented, and you have to have some sort of naturalism plus. That naturalism has to include both logic and mathematics that are outside of the universe, outside the physical universe. So pure naturalism just fails at this point. Biblical theism would say that we are discovering God's methods and God's mind, and he's given us the capability to understand some of this. And then also beauty. We see beauty in the universe. Why do we find things beautiful? This is the Crab supernova. It was seen in around 1060 AD by Arab and Chinese astronomers or observers. And today it's expanded for what, almost 1,000 years. And why do we find so many things like this beautiful in nature? And beyond just the physical universe, music. We see beauty in music. There's something transcendent about music. A number of people have said that their faith journey started by listening to Bach. My wife has a friend whose husband became a Christian after hearing Bach and thinking there must be something transcendent. According to Walter Isaacson, Steve Jobs, after hearing Yo-Yo Ma play for him in his home, teared up and said, "Your playing is the best argument I've ever heard for God, because I don't really believe a human alone can do this." Why do we find nature and music beautiful? What gives the transcendent quality to these things? How do our two worldviews explain this? Naturalism would have to say it's some sort of a Darwinian emergence. But how? Is there some sort of a gene for love of beauty or a love of music? How does that work? Maybe an appreciation for beauty could help us to find food, but what about music? How does naturalism explain the beauty that we see in music? Biblical theism, it's simple. God loves beauty, and he made man in his image, so man loves beauty too. And then morality. All societies have some sort of a sense of good and bad, but where does that come from? Richard Dawkins has said, in a universe, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. And this is, I think, where you're led to with naturalism, that you've got to say there is no good and no evil. But all societies have a sense of good and evil. Even Richard Dawkins, he calls religion evil. And how can that be if there is no good or no evil? One of the classic arguments against biblical theism is, why would a good God allow evil and suffering? But according to Scripture, he does allow it, and he already had plans to address it by sending his son. Naturalism, though, has a bigger problem than this. Why do we consider anything to be good or evil? As Dawkins says, from a naturalistic framework, there should be no good or evil. So how do our two worldviews explain this? Naturalism would say that our sense of good and evil is some sort of a social Darwinism, that it's evolved in our society, but it's very difficult to explain things like altruism. Why would somebody sacrifice to help someone else? And a friend of ours, Gart, he explains that this idea of social Darwinism is not the same as biological Darwinism. There's no genes to pass on social Darwinism. It's kind of a construct that's been invented, but there's no good explanation for it by the naturalists. And altruism, if you think about it, doesn't make a lot of sense. Hitler's view is a much more reasonable Darwinian response than altruism. Just wipe out your enemies, be the bigger and badder of the bunch. But biblical theism would say God is good. God defines morality, and he built a sense of morality in mankind when he created man in his image. So we've looked at these areas, 6 evidences for existence of God. None of these are proofs that God exists. They're evidences, and any single evidence here can be argued against. But view these as like a thread in a tapestry. Which tapestry looks better? Naturalism or biblical theism? Which is the better explanation for all of these things? Which worldview best explains the evidence? Now, a couple of cautions. I think there are some arguments to avoid, and I didn't use these arguments. One is called the God of the gaps argument, arguing that here's something that we don't understand, and so God must do it. And then we come along and we find a scientific explanation for it, and then we push God out of the picture. I didn't use that type of argument. In fact, the arguments I used, I think the more we learn in science, the stronger the argument is for existence of God. In fact, one of the quotes I had said that the more we learn, the more amazing these things are. A second argument that we should avoid is arguments that say science is wrong. There are many Christians who argue against modern science. They don't like the long ages for the universe, and age of the earth at 4.5 billion years, age of the universe at 13.7 billion years. And ever since I was a kid, I've heard arguments, supposed scientific arguments, that the earth is only a few thousand years old and the universe only a few thousand years old. Every one of those that I've investigated is a bogus argument. It's either based on bad data or bad logic. Now, people keep coming up with new arguments, so I haven't looked at every one that's out there, but I'm convinced that that's not a good way to argue, saying that science is wrong. Rather, I think we should take the tack that science is limited. Science can only answer certain things in certain arenas. And Erwin Schrödinger, you might have heard of Schrödinger. He's the guy who may have had a cat. Schrödinger said, the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives lots of factual information, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart, that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. So what he's saying is science is limited. It can only answer certain questions in certain fields. We should never think that science answers all questions. Now, we've seen a number of evidences here for God's existence. But so far, this is just evidence that a creator God exists, that the piano maker exists, not a piano player. Is there any evidence that God is still active in the universe, that he's actually playing the piano? And I'd like to think a little bit about this. Stephen Hawking takes the view of deism, or he expresses the view of deism. He says these natural laws may have originally been decreed by God, but it appears that he has since left the universe to evolve according to them and does not now intervene in it. So this was early Stephen Hawking, before he was such an outspoken atheist. And he's describing deism. That's the idea that God created things and then just left the scene and lets them all run like a machine. And many Christians have a similar idea, unfortunately. Many Christians think that the universe and the scientific laws just run like a clock. It's a machine. When I was a kid, I remember coming home once and telling my dad that something I learned in science class. I told him, I understand it now. I figured it out. God made these scientific laws, and then the universe just runs according to the laws. And my dad probably told me that was deism, and I didn't understand it because I was a kid. But that's deism, and a lot of us have that idea, and it's not a biblical idea. So let's look and see, is God still active in the universe? And I think there's 5 areas where we can see that he is active. He's active by interactions in history. And we see that especially in the Bible. It's hard to interpret some things otherwise if God wasn't active, especially with the incarnation of Jesus. God is active there. Fulfilled prophecy. We see prophecies in the Bible. Naturalism would say, well, the prophecies are just vague, and we're reading an interpretation into them after the fact. For example, the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece said to Alexander, if you go to war, a great army will fall. Well, it's going to be true no matter who wins the war. But some biblical prophecy, though, was very detailed. And We can't just explain it as post-diction, reading things in after the fact, and it's not vague. Answered prayer. Many of us have prayed to God and seen him answer. Naturalism would explain that by random chance. Well, you just prayed for something and something happened and you thought it was an answer to prayer. Biblical theism recognizes that often these answers are too detailed to be just chance. Changed lives. I think this is one of the stronger ones. Francis Collins was the former director of the NIH, National Institutes of Health. He's an outspoken Christian. He was an atheist medical student doing rounds with terminal patients, and he noticed that Christians had more hope than non-Christians. And one patient asked him what he believed. He really realized that he had never really looked at the evidence for atheism. And so he began to, and he became a Christian. Harry Ironside was a street preacher in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. And one day preaching in San Francisco, he was challenged to a debate by an atheist. And he said, I'll debate you on one condition. You bring me one person who was in the gutter, who had no hope, who heard your message of atheism and it turned his life around and gave him hope. I'll bring you a dozen people who've heard the message of the scriptures, and then we'll debate. And the debate, of course, never happened. Changed lives, I think, is a very powerful evidence for God's activity in the world. Naturalism would explain this just as false hope and false assurance, but is it really? And then miracles and natural law. What is a miracle? According to naturalism, miracles don't exist. Hume said it's impossible to break natural law. It's just unexplained natural phenomenon. But biblical theism says that God is acting in the world all the time. He normally acts in a predictable way that we can understand, but sometimes he acts in an unpredictable way, in an unusual way, and that's what we call miracle. And the main miracle in Scripture is the resurrection. How can a scientist believe in miracles? This is often a question I am asked and others are asked. So let's think a little bit about what natural law is and what miracles are. Stephen Hawking has said, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. It's not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. So he gave up his previous accommodation to deism, and now he says we don't even need God. This is later in his life. Now notice he wrote this in The Guardian on September 2nd, 2010. And notice he's saying it's got to be the law of nature or God. It's one or the other. It's a dichotomy. The next day, our friend John Lennox replied to him, said Hawking's claim is misguided. He asks us to choose between God and the laws of physics as if they were necessarily in mutual conflict. But contrary to what Hawking claims, physical laws can never provide a complete explanation of the universe. Laws themselves do not create anything. They are merely a description of what happens under certain conditions. He's saying natural law is descriptive, not prescriptive. It describes, it doesn't cause. And that was expressed also by one of the first Christians I read about Christianity and science, Donald Mackay. He wrote, scientific laws do not prescribe what must happen. They describe what has happened. The earth does not go around the sun because Newton's or Einstein's law makes it or tells it to. The earth goes its own way, and the scientific laws are our generalized way of describing how it goes. Now, I want you to get the impact of this. What these guys are saying, Lennox and Mackay, is not what our society tells us. It's not what our science classes tell us. This is not the way we think normally and the way we're taught to think about science. And I remember I must have read Donald Mackay and had a discussion with my thesis advisor when I was in grad school. And I bounced this idea off of him, and he thought about it. And he said, well, that's not the way I see it, but that is consistent with the universe. That's a tenable view. All we can know from science is that we have these natural laws and they describe things. We can't tell whether they cause things or not. All we can say for sure is they describe them. And it's a philosophical position whether or not the natural law causes. And if you think more deeply, it's hard to see how a natural law can actually cause something. It describes things. And both of these guys, John Lennox and Donald Mackay, are from the UK. And I believe they both got this idea from an earlier, very clear thinker, C.S. Lewis. And he wrote in God in the Dock a very good essay on the laws of nature. And he was having a discussion with a friend who said this young man survived the war, World War I, just because, not because of someone's prayer, but just because he was standing in the right spot not to get hit by the bullet. And the bullet was following a course controlled by the laws of nature, and it couldn't do anything else. And so Lewis started thinking about that, and he concluded that in the whole history of the universe, the laws of nature have never produced a single event. They're the pattern to which every event must conform, provided only that it can be induced to happen. And I think he's correct. It's worth reading this essay. It's a very good essay about laws of nature. He was not a scientist, but he really understood things and thought clearly. What does Scripture say about this? It says that God is still active. He waters the mountains, present tense, from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of his works. He causes the grass to grow for cattle and vegetation for the labor of man, so that he may bring forth food from the earth. You appoint darkness, and it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest prowl around. The young lions roar after their prey and seek their food from God. There's an interplay here. And the ancients understood the water cycle. It's described in Job, one of the oldest books in the scriptures. But the psalmist can still say that God is the one who waters the mountains, even though they understood it comes from rain clouds. And he says God is the one who feeds the lions. It's not God or nature. It can be both, God and nature working together. And how can that be? The New Testament tells us he is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature, and God upholds things, all things, by the word of his power. He is before all things. In him all things hold together. Richard Bube was the head of material science department at Stanford University, and he wrote once that if God were to let go of the universe for a split second, the whole universe would cease to exist. It's God who is holding it all together and making it keep working. So, natural law, how do our two worldviews explain it? Biblical theism says natural laws don't govern or cause anything. They just describe things. It's our description of God's normal way of operating in his universe. Nature is only consistent because God is consistent and unchanging. And miracles are just his unusual operation in his universe, to get our attention or do something special. It's like he's normally playing nice chords on the piano, but every once in a while he'll play a dissonant note to get our attention. How does naturalism describe this? They would say, well, natural law is actually causing things. And they would say miracles just don't exist. It's just natural law that we haven't yet discovered. So miracles become a science of the gaps. It's unknown science that we haven't discovered yet. Jack Collins explains very well the Christian view, biblical view, First, every natural event is the work of God, as well as the work of the created things involved. Second, we should not say that a supernatural event has God more directly involved, while a natural event has him only indirectly involved. God is working directly in both kinds of events, in the natural to maintain the natural properties, in the supernatural ones to go beyond those properties. So we shouldn't be afraid of natural explanations or science. We shouldn't be afraid of these scientific explanations. They help explain God's activity. They help make it richer. We see how God does things. The piano is not just a player piano. It needs a pianist in the biblical worldview. Naturalism says it's a player piano. It's working automatically. And again, some of us have accepted those ideas from our culture. Those are unbiblical. Natural law is given causative power. It's made pre-existent and eternal. In a sense, the natural law replaces God. Romans 1:25, they have exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the creator, who is blessed forever. So which view fits the data better? For miracles, it's pretty clear that natural law can't explain them, or I mean, naturalism can't explain them, but biblical theism does. So in summary, two things we've looked at this evening. First question, is there a God? And we've looked at 6 evidences for a God. Second question, if there is a God, if he does exist, is he still active in the universe? And 5 evidences that I think show that he is active. Which of these 2 worldviews, naturalism or biblical theism, fits the data better? Which one explains the world that we live in? You have to decide for yourselves. And I haven't proven this evening that God exists. I've just presented some evidence, and hopefully I've convinced you it's intellectually respectable to hold a biblical worldview. We don't need to be afraid of scientists disproving God. And for me, probably the strongest evidence that I believe in God is that I know him. I've met him. I have a relationship with him. It's an existential, experiential evidence. And we can all have that evidence. We can all know God. Before we end, a couple more comments. Naturalism, in a sense, is self-defeating. C.S. Lewis points out, if minds are wholly dependent on brains, and brains on biochemistry, and biochemistry in the long run on the meaningless flux of the atoms, I cannot understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than a sound of the wind in the trees. And in one of his broadcasts, he said, if this naturalism is true, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore I have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. So you run into all sorts of self-defeating arguments if you take naturalism to its logical conclusion. And as C.S. Lewis has said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Thank you for this time tonight. And here's some recommended resources. Some of these are, I recommend all of these, especially I like Gavin Ortland's recent book, Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God, is very good. John Lennox, I like everything John Lennox writes. And Jack Collins. So I think we have time for questions.
First of all, thank you, Kirk. That was a wonderful presentation, very comprehensive. I know every one of those points could be developed for hours.
Yep.
So thank you for giving us a good overview of this topic. If anyone has questions, please, if you're in the room, come up to the microphone. If you're on Zoom, feel free to jump in and ask a question.
And if you want to snap a picture of this screen before I stop sharing, go ahead. I'll stop sharing so you can see me more clearly when you ask questions.
I'll make to start, I'll make a comment and then get your ideas as well.
Sure.
In terms of prophecy, I know the naturalists say that well, you're reading into scripture, but I think the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the dating of them, 1 to 200 BC, with the much of the Bible, including Isaiah and a number of the other prophets in that find, really argues very strongly for the truth of the prophecies, and particularly truth of the prophecies concerning Jesus of Nazareth. So I know there's a lot to be developed on that too, but I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, good. Thanks. I agree with you. Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls included the entire book of Isaiah, and that includes Isaiah 53 that talks about the suffering Messiah.
Yeah, so my question is very simple. The James Webb Space Telescope has brought back some amazing photographs, but one of the conclusions that I read is that some people who have a different agenda are saying that the evidence supports that the universe is older than what we thought, and it's throwing into question the whole Big Bang theory.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a good question. And my wife and I, a couple of months ago, were just down at a whole day workshop at Reasons to Believe headquarters in West Covina, where they discussed this. And the James Webb Space Telescope is making some discoveries that are causing us to rethink and revise how we understand the Big Bang. It looks like some of these early galaxies, they look more mature than we would expect at that early age. And people are still puzzling through that. One of the explanations may be that in the early parts of in the early era of the universe, things were so dense that galaxies came together more quickly than was thought. They're still studying these things. It does not disprove the Big Bang model, but it may cause us to revise the model a bit.